Hi, I'm Matthias, and this is something you've seen before, the US automatic pistol caliber 45 model of 1911. The difference today is that this wasn't made by Colt's patent firearms. This one is a Springfield 1911. Let's see some of the differences in the light box. Something that's the same is the overall length at 8.5 inches, and mine weighs 2.3 pounds, a little lighter than the Colt we saw last time, but that may just be manufacturing variances. Otherwise, this pistol is nearly identical except for very minor details. We of course have a detachable 7-round single-stack box magazine and chamber the 45 ACP cartridge. Before we get started, don't forget that today's episode, like all other primers, will likely never break even in terms of production cost from YouTube's advertising. They don't like the topic much. Instead, we're primarily funded by our patrons. If you want to keep the documentaries coming and make sure that they're still available for the general public, please consider joining us. Our donors are also thankfully backed up with support from Ballistol, the gun oil that we've thankfully been using for the entirety of the show long before we managed to lure them into helping us with the mission. I know there's a lot of debate about what makes for the best possible gun oil available on the market, but when it comes to collectibles, Ballistol has one clear edge. It's been preserving now historical firearms for well over 100 years without any difficulty. The original formula is safe for both metal and wood. Simply spread it over your beloved and wipe off any extra. Ballistol maintains a protective finish, but thankfully never hardens. A favorite of museums and collectors, it has a proven track record decades beyond the rest. If you hit their site, you'll also find plenty of extras that may help you in cleaning and preserving your collectibles as well. Make sure to tell them that we sent you. Today's episode is one of what has become a fairly large series exploring the decade-long development of the world-famous Colt model of 1911 pistol. If you're here to get that story, I recommend you rewind by at least one, as our last episode told Colt's story in particular through the Great War. We'll also see more from them in our next episode about foreign sales. Right now, however, all we have to know is that the model of 1911 was adopted by the United States in March of 1911, and within days, a series of negotiations were begun that ultimately resulted in both Colt's first contract and an agreement for government manufacture. The terms were as follows. Colt's patent firearms would allow licensed manufacture only after 50,000 model of 1911 pistols were purchased by the government. After this condition was satisfied, Ordnance would have the right to manufacture up to 33 1/3% of the total number of 1911s ordered by the government. Colt would get the remaining 66 2/3%. Even then, Ordnance would have to pay a $2 royalty to Colt per pistol in order to cover Browning's patents. Now, just to be clear, this decision was unusual as the US government had not often opted to produce its own handguns. The last instance that I can think of is the model of 1855 stocked pistol produced by Springfield. Both before, during, and after this pistol, however, the vast majority of single-shot pistols and later revolvers were sourced from the commercial market. With the first automatic pistol, however, it was felt that the Springfield Armory could save the taxpayer some cash. Founded in 1777 as the United States' first federal armory, its location was approved by George Washington based on the recommendations of General Henry Knox, set in the town of Springfield, Massachusetts. Sadly, a complete history of the armory would be well beyond our scope today, so we'll fast forward nearly 150 years. By the time the 1911 was adopted, the primary small arm concern of the arsenal was the US rifle model of 1903. Although I might argue that we should call this the 1903-05, along with its .6 cartridge. Regardless, it turns out rifle production would be the primary influence on government manufacture of the 1911 pistol. That's because when the decision was made to manufacture at Springfield, there were two big ways to accomplish this. The first would be to establish a complete production line so that it had all new equipment, likely a new building, and its own independent staff for making handguns. Or they could use the same staff, same floor space, and even some of the same machines and tools, but not all, as the rifle line. This would mean that you could produce either handguns or rifles, but not both at the same time. Given the size of the US Army in that period, frankly tiny compared to nations of similar population and even smaller landmass, mind you, it was felt that just 1/3 of all pistols needed wouldn't justify separate facilities. So option 2 was selected and funding was sought out, which, although it took time to arrange, wasn't really a big hurry because, again, they still had to hit that magic 50,000 units ordered from Colts. Given production of some 23,333 pistols, Ordnance believed Springfield could deliver them at a cost of just $7.50 each. Adding on the $2 royalty and an estimated 70 cents of overhead, the final cost would be $10.20. That was still $4 and a nickel under the cost at Colts. Recall from last time, the first Colt contract was for 31,344 pistols, followed by another 4,000, and then after some arguing back and forth, the Navy's 7,000 unit order was counted towards the 50,000 unit lockout. Even so, it would take several more orders through 1911 and into 1912 until the second naval contract finally tipped the scale in March. So on the 1st of June 1912, Colt sent over a handful of Model 1911 pistols to be used as reference models by Springfield, because frankly Colt wasn't running off their own drawings so much as a series of settings and limits on their machines. Working up from these examples, of course, took time, as did the setup of the remaining necessary tooling and installation of new machines. Not only that, but again, Springfield was still responsible for rifle production and other ordnance services. On December 27, 1912, the order to begin production of 11,285 pistols was given by John T. Thompson. If that number seems odd, to date 72,570 pistols had been ordered from Colts. Remove the 50,000 unit lead and divide by 2 in order to reach 1/3 of production. It's worth noting that Ordnance wanted all of the 1911 pistols in one continuous serial line. Since they didn't want to constantly resynchronize with Colts, it was best to just reserve each contract, be it Arsenal or private, as a big old serial block. Colt had been contracted for 72,570 pistols so far, so Springfield's first batch started at number 72,571. This practice would continue throughout production. Unfortunately, it turns out that the gear up was still going slowly. The annual report for the fiscal year of 1913 only listed that preparation of tools, fixtures, and gauges was practically completed. By December of 1913, it was noted that pistol production had been delayed. This was explained as being caused by production needs for the Model 1909 machine rifle and the Model 1913 cavalry sword, which had more pressing need in the service as neither was being provided from a commercial source like the pistol. Springfield's first model of 1911s were completed in January of 1914, though they were largely handmade. These were tested and then sent on to the Chief of Ordnance for examination and approval in February. Once that approval came, production began in earnest, and at that point actually carried on fairly smoothly. In the meantime, though, Colt was also contracted for more pistols, so another order would be put in for 5,000 at Springfield in May of 1914, basically just as production was ramping up. Springfield-made 1911s were specifically designed to have 100% interchangeable parts with the Colts. However, that doesn't mean that they were identical. So let's borrow this guy, take a closer look. Alright, we have the Springfield 1911, and just for comparison, just last time we had this Colt. Now, they are near identical pistols for a reason. They're supposed to be 100% parts interchangeable with each other. That doesn't mean everything is identical. The most glaring differences are going to be the finish and the markings. In terms of the finish, this is a later war brush blue, although not the final Black Army finish. And it has sort of a higher gloss. It's got a texture to it because it is the brush blue. Even before that, the Colt's bluing process was much more blue. Whereas the bluing on the Springfield is much more like a 1903 rifle. It has a tendency to fade to more of a brown color. It's definitely not as sharp a color as Colt's process. However, it's less reflective, a very nice matte, and certainly much more of what you'd expect from a military piece. If I get these guys separated, we'll be able to see, you know what, let me zoom in. Instead of being marked by Colt, we're of course marked by Springfield, although Colt's patent dates are still preserved here. We have the same United States property marking. For inspection, we have an ordnance bomb for an ordnance inspector. And back here we have the ordnance logo where Colt had originally put their rampant Colt. It's basically 1-for-1 on changing out Colt for Springfield. On the other side, we have model of 1911 US Army, same as the Colt, and we have our serial number. These would have been the same series as the Colts, so there'd be no duplication. There shouldn't be a Colt with the same serial number as a Springfield. Above that is a rather nicely done Federal Eagle. True differences from the Colt are going to be very minor. Things like the fact that this front sight is absolutely integral to the slide. It is not fitted in place as a separate piece. You're going to have a lot of little milling differences, like right here on the slide. There's, if you're really keen-eyed, differences to the safeties and their shapes. That's something that I recommend getting a book for. Comparing to the Colt's rear sight, this is the Colt, this is the Springfield. The radius is just a little tighter on these corners, but it's hardly going to make much of a difference. Springfield started with short hammers just like Colt had. Both of these pistols, however, have been given lengthened hammer spurs to make it easier to thumb cock. Being able to put them next to each other, you can kind of tell that the Springfield's is still just a bit longer, a little bit narrower, and in this case, this guy's actually had that undercut on the back done fairly pronounced to help prevent pinching of the hand. This, not so much. I assure you, I have scratches to prove it. It's probably hard to pick up on the camera, but the Springfield's grips also have slightly deeper, more coarse checkering. This again is one of those finesses that you have to pick up on after looking at many examples. One of the most obvious differences is here in the magazines. Colt on this side, Springfield right here. Boy, that stands right out. That's because while Colt struggled with their particular brand of tubing, Springfield opted to work with sheet steel first, forming, welding, and folding over the bottom plate. This was before being cyanide hardened, before being blasted and blued, though they did opt to only blue the lower half in order to avoid ruining the hardening of the feed lips and magazine notch. Now, internally, there is no real difference in operation from the Colt 1911 of a Springfield or Colt make. Interchangeable was interchangeable, so I don't think we need another animation. But while we have this, we might as well let May take a few shots with it. It feels completely different. So, how much did the 1911 actually cost Springfield? Well, after the first contract, it averaged to $13.26 each, still less than Colt's, but just by 99 cents. It did, however, give the US more production capacity, so that's nice. Changes during Springfield's production were actually fairly limited. We covered the alterations of the 1911 hammer and safety in our last episode. These decisions were also applied to Springfield's production, as was Ordnance's decision to drop the magazine loop in late 1915. However, because they were fairly far ahead in magazine production, almost all Springfield 1911s continued to come with the loop until just about at the end of production. By this time, of course, most of Europe was at war, and sure, there was a trickling stream of 1911 production at the armory, but for the most part, their hands were tied by the government's neutral stance. Unfortunately for Ordnance, this wasn't going to last, and they would soon have to deal with an astounding level of growth. Let me put it to you this way. The size of the US Army in 1916 was shy of 109,000 men. The National Defense Act of 1916 had granted for up to 175,000 in peacetime or 300,000 in wartime. In 1918, with the US fully in the war, there were just shy of 2,400,000. And for every man, there would need to be equipment, plus reserves and replacements. You might think that this would mean that Springfield needed to kick pistol production into high gear, but unfortunately they had opted for Plan B, combining rifle and pistol production. That means choosing between the two, one or the other. Trying to alternate would mean huge swaths of downtime as machines were reconfigured back and forth. With the US declaring war on Germany April 6, 1917, it's no surprise that on April 15th, Chief of Ordnance Crozier suspended pistol production at Springfield. Of 36,095 total pistols ordered since the start of production at Springfield, only 25,767 would be delivered. Surplus frames, slides, and other parts were then sent to Colt for further use. The value of these was deducted from US payments. The machinery was then placed in storage. While this decision helped stabilize rifle production, it severely impacted the supply of handguns. As we saw last time, Ordnance would take up 3 plans in order to fix this problem. Introduce substitute standard handguns, expand Colt's production, and establish other manufacturers. The substitutes were the Smith & Wesson and Colt 1917 revolvers, capable of chambering the .45 ACP cartridge and even loading with helpful half-moon clips. Colt's patent firearms ramped up as much as they could, but they were stymied by both the market and the government. As for other manufacturers, the most obvious would be other major gun makers. First up was Remington UMC, who had fairly recently incorporated after the merging of Remington Arms and Union Metallic Cartridge. They had expanded their Bridgeport and Ilion plants dramatically to meet overseas demand for rifles and cartridges, most notably the Mosin-Nagant for the Russian Empire, which involved the creation of a new factory on Boston Avenue in 1915, and unfortunately resulted in a default sometime after the Russian government fell to pieces in November of 1917. It's also worth mentioning that Remington's premier firearms designer in this period was John Douglas Pedersen. We've seen this man on numerous episodes, but in reference to World War I, let's hit the highlights. Early on, commercial designs, particularly the .44 caliber Remington 14 1/2 pump action rifle, were shipped to the British for emergency naval service. The US opted for his Model 10 shotgun as modified for a bayonet, although this was done after our story today. It was in limited numbers and limited service, and never saw frontline action. By spring of 1917, Pedersen was done designing a secret project for the US Army. This was written down in the records as a .30 caliber pistol, but in reality it was a replacement bolt for the 1903 rifle, which converted the long arm into a pistol caliber semi-automatic. The notion was wild, the product unreliable, and thankfully none were ever actually issued. In September of 1917, Remington would also receive an order for the Browning 1917 machine gun. Suffice it to say, they were staying busy. Even with all of that, Pedersen had also worked up his own .45 caliber handgun. This used his hesitation locking action, said to be simpler and easier to manufacture than the 1911. Remington UMC attempted to lure Ordnance into purchases starting in November of 1917. While the pistol was lightly tested, Ordnance wasn't much interested in switching horses midstream. Instead, memos about the Remington pistol already note that they were planning to place an order for 1911 production with the established gunmaker. The actual contract followed on December 29th of 1917. The initial order was for 150,000 Model 1911 pistols. Despite the late date, it seems that this had been on the table for some months ahead of time. Now, rewinding back to the Russian rifles, because Remington had required an initial payment to begin building up the production line, the machinery had been made property of the Russian government. It was hoped that many of these could be turned over to the problem at hand. However, there were obvious complications with the US negotiating with their purchase when the government was barely holding on. While that was being sorted, Colt was to provide technical support for Remington. In theory, this meant specific drawings, but these proved lackluster. They didn't include any tolerances, and a corrected set was sent in March. Those drawings and Springfield's, despite the interchangeability of their parts, did not agree with each other. Apparently, there was a lot of hands-on experience needed. In the end, Remington would end up with 10 Colt 1911 sample pistols. They tested and selected 5 of them for their complete interchangeability, then used these as their minimum and maximum tolerances. Thankfully, their prototype worked fine, so this method was worked into a set of drawings. That makes 3 distinct, different plans for how to make a 1911. Under Ordnance request, Colt also provided direct technical support, meaning that they had to spare critical staff to help establish the production line. As an interesting aside, in February of 1918, Remington UMC informed Ordnance that they were having trouble setting up for the checkering required on black walnut stock plates. This matter dragged on long enough that in April they were given permission to temporarily use brown bakelite panels as a substitute. During 1918, the matter was thankfully resolved without the need of plastics. These examples are actually from World War II. Even while Remington was being spun up, the need for pistols was growing. Not only did the US need the usual number for officers and special troops, plus the uniquely American love of sidearms, there was also a growing need for rapid, semi-automatic handguns in the Great War itself. One of Pershing's own cablegrams conveyed the importance of the humble handgun. Manufacturing program of pistols for year 1918 entirely inadequate to meet cumulative requirements. Experience has proven that pistol is the most valuable weapon in trench fighting. It is exceedingly important that total needs of AEF be provided for. As you might recall from our Ruby episode, France would end up purchasing over 1 million handguns from Spain during the war. These had been the most expedient way for them to avoid the same problem now dogging the Americans. In order to keep up and prepare for the continuation of fighting in 1919, the US was going to need more than even that. So in March, Remington UMC's contract was pulled and reissued. It now totaled some 500,000 pistols. The price for each, cost plus 10%, in order to account for the ever-punishing wartime supply and labor shortages. It was hoped that the deliveries would begin in June. While Remington UMCs sped into production, Ordnance continued to search for other sources of 1911 pistols. Next up was Winchester Repeating Arms, who received their contract on March 30th of 1918. Like Remington, they were to provide 500,000 Model 1911 automatics. This was, again, on a cost plus 10% profit basis. They also requested $200,000 advance to help set up production facilities over the coming months. This would eventually rise to $500,000. Moreover, Winchester noted that they were working through their 1917 rifle contract too quickly to transition the skilled workers to the pistol project. They estimated another order for 100,000 rifles would keep the men in place and paid while they started up the 1911. They were provided 20 sample pistols and a partial set of drawings. Once again, this spiraled. Winchester even went so far as to suggest that they could speed up the start of production if Ordnance allowed for only 90% interchangeability of parts for the first 28,000 pistols, by the end of which they'd guaranteed 100% interchangeability. Ordnance did not go for this. Alright, Remington UMC and Winchester are starting on the 1911 problem. Springfield is out of the running, Colt is still currently the only one making them. Alright, they've been at it, but they can't expand any further thanks to the War Industries Board, who in April of 1918 had banned any new factories being established in New England as transportation and coal shortages had become acute. Since Colt couldn't make any more pistols, nor could any of the other established gun makers in that concentrated area, Ordnance had to reach out literally further, and boy did they. In June of 1918, they contracted with A.J. Savage of San Diego, California, son of the founder of the famous Savage Arms Corporation. His contract was for 100,000 government model 1911 pistols at a price of $14.50 each, or just $14 without magazines. The former Ross Rifle Company of Quebec, Canada had become the Dominion Rifle Factory, assembling unfinished Ross rifles on hand until March of 1918, when the factory began dismantling. When Ordnance came knocking, the North American Arms Company was incorporated by 2 Toronto lawyers, and in July they were contracted for 500,000 pistols 1911 for $15.50 each. Still in July, the National Cash Register Company of Dayton, Ohio received a contract for 100,000 pistols on a cost plus 10% payment, at least for the first 10,000. The rest would be negotiated later. And in August of 1918, another contract was let out to the Caron brothers of Montreal, Canada. This was for 300,000 pistols at a cost plus 10% for the first 10,000. Negotiating the rest later, they were also advanced some $140,000 for assembling the necessary tools. August of 1918 is also when Remington began to pay out. They had finally started shipping 1911 pistols, like this one here. Let me go ahead and put this in the light box. You won't be surprised when I say that this is 8.5 inches long and weighs in at 2.4 pounds with a 7-round detachable box magazine chambering the 45 ACP cartridge. Of course, this example isn't necessarily the one I have in my hands, but rather a well-preserved specimen that we've had access to previously. One is for show, the other for shooting, but before that, we should probably go ahead and get a closer look. Alright, this is a Remington UMC 1911. Forgive its condition, this is fairly worn, but I should be so happy to look like this in 100 years. Now, this dark section here at the front, that's what we'd expect. The rest, okay. Compared to the other 2 pistols, this actually has the most differences in terms of manufacturing, although from the user's perspective, it shouldn't be any different than any other wartime pre-war 1911. It's just that there's some obvious corner cutting going on in very minor details. Some of these tiny little interactions, like a Remington safety versus a Colt safety, or whether or not the mag release should look exactly that way, those are going to be down to you looking it up in a proper book at the time that you're looking to find one of these. However, I want to point a couple obvious things out. Let's go ahead and start with those markings. Manufactured by Remington Arms UMC Company Incorporated, Bridgeport, Connecticut, USA. And on this side, we have Colt's patents as required. And interestingly, we have the Remington UMC logo in between them, right in the middle. There is no logo at the back as we previously saw on the Colts and the Springfields. It's interesting to me because Colt would move their logo from here to there. And we'll also see that the recommended pattern for marking on what would be some other manufacturers also puts the manufacturer's logo here. In other words, this was becoming something of a standardized format, and yet we'll see that it doesn't ultimately go anywhere. On the side, we also have United States property, and as usual, we have an inspection mark right here above our magazine release. Although that might be difficult to see, let me pop you a photo. That is EEC for Major Edmund E. Chapman. On the other side, we have the model of 1911 US Army, and of course the serial number. These were not in the same series as the Colts and the Springfields. Remington got to start from 1. One of the more obviously different parts on a Remington, other than, slight changes in hammer and grip safety and things, is the obvious changes in the serrations. They're frankly much more crudely cut than they are on the Colts or the Springfields. The Colts tend to be a little bit wider like this, but not as ragged. The Springfields tend to be tighter, but not as tight as, say, that really, really narrow first serration. I mean, that thing is wild, and yet it seems to be fairly consistent across all of them. They're not quite evenly spaced, especially at the tips. They tend to be a little skirted, a little wider at the bottom, and it doesn't look like it's being done from being banged around. They're frankly just slightly off, and even in terms of where they've been cut down in the depths, there tends to be an unevenness of the surface itself. I'm not sure how they were cut compared to the other two manufacturers, but it must have been in some way distinct or rushed. Another key difference can be found with the magazines made by Remington, which are a little bit snug in this case, but also difficult to tell apart from, say, standard Colt production. In this case, let me grab a flat bottom Colt, right? You're not going to see a whole lot of difference between the two unless you're really eagle-eyed, unless we flip these guys up. In this case, it becomes a little more apparent if you focus exclusively on the toe. Colt's is longer and pointier. This is slightly shorter, and it's got a stubbiness to it, a little bit more flat at the front and rounded on the sides. That is the tell for a proper Remington mag. Much of their magazine production was outsourced to Raymond Engineering Company of New York. A blank mag is Remington's own, if it's the correct dimensions. And with an R on the bottom of the toe, well, that's Raymond. That's not to be confused with Risden from our last episode. Despite its similarities to the previous Colt and Springfield examples, I'd still say we should let May give this a try. If they don't find you handsome, they should at least find you handy. When it came time to serial the Remington pistols, Ordnance realized it was pointless to continue to try and assign serial blocks, so they allowed them to start from number 1. Even with Remington up and running, though, there were more problems. By this time, Ordnance was so desperate for handguns that they considered plans to commandeer every 38 and 45 caliber pistol in civilian hands in the United States. This mostly focused on wholesalers, but they weren't above going further. They even appropriated the sales records for both Colt and Smith & Wesson for the previous 5 years. However, it was deemed impractical and likely to just cause more work. They thankfully just asked for donations from the public and received approximately bupkis. Now, to be fair, their 38 was likely still 38 long Colt, as only the model of 1903 Colt New Army and a fair few Smith & Wessons could handle the 38 Smith & Wesson cartridges. And even then, I really mean plain Smith & Wesson, which was the most common commercial revolver cartridge of that day. Special wasn't even selling that well comparatively, so if you ask for all the 38s, you're going to get a bunch of stuff you can't shoot. 45 ACP also hadn't had much time to penetrate the civilian market either. The 1905 had been around, sure, but it was never particularly popular and now well out of production. The new government model did better, but still wasn't a common purchase. So, getting impatient, Ordnance decided to check in with Winchester. They sent out Elbert Cyril, famed inventor of the Savage pistols, who currently held the title of Pistol Expert for the Bridgeport District. He inspected Winchester's plant on August 30th, 1918. He was not impressed. The tooling was mostly stored. None of the current personnel were intended to be switched over to pistol production, which is weird because of that whole rifle negotiation. Many of the jigs and fixtures were far from complete, and to him it seemed that there was no serious effort to begin production. Winchester's Edwin Pugsley stated that the matter had hinged on the procurement of certain machines that were currently in storage, property of the British government. Winchester also was largely looking to outsource their production, which was unlikely to really proceed in volume until after March of 1919. From this and other reporting, the Winchester contract was reduced. First dropped to $200,000 in total, and then just $100,000. The balance of $400,000 was actually applied to the totals for National Cash Register, who was actually the darling of the new manufacturers. Setup for them was moving fairly briskly. On September 11th of 1918, another contract was let out for the manufacture of 1911s, this time with the Lanston Monotype Company of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. 100,000 pistols, cost plus 10% for the first 30,000, final price to be decided. On the 23rd, Savage Arms Corporation of Utica, New York agreed to provide 300,000 pistols at $15.50 for the first 30,000, final price to be negotiated. Next up was Burroughs Adding Machine Company of Detroit, Michigan, who was apparently in talks with Ordnance ahead of their contracts because they signed for 250,000 pistols on November 3rd, 1918 at a price of $1.50 profit for the first 25,000, balance to be negotiated. Fun fact, by the way, it turns out that Winchester was right about parts interchangeability. Remington UMC was struggling and never managed to reach the dictated requirements. An October test of 20 samples found that only 5 would function properly when exchanging out the parts. Ordnance was so desperate that they let it slide as long as the pistols ran well, which thankfully they actually did. For all their faults, the Remington UMCs were actually very reliable every time they were tested, at least for wartime standards. Now, this situation of interchangeability, however, led to a November 1st meeting that involved all of the 1911 manufacturers, including one that signed 2 days later, but not, for some reason, A.J. Savage in California. This was done to establish once and for all the final machine drawings, tolerances, and planning for this insanely massive project. Just for scale, counting every 1911 ordered minus Colt, that would be 2,650,000. Colt's wartime contracts added another 700,000 more. That's just wartime commercial sales of 3,350,000 and some change, planned through the end of 1919. Every expectation was that this would hopefully be enough, given the ever-growing scale of the conflict. Now, all that's really just to show how incredibly surprised everyone would be when just 10 days after their multi-million pistol meeting, the whole war was called off. On November 11th of 1918, the Armistice of Compiègne was signed at 5:45 a.m. This ended hostilities across the board. However, it was not a formal surrender. Even so, the armistice had a chilling effect on wartime production. All of a sudden, those grand spring offensives of 1919 were completely unnecessary. A great and noble savings on human life that also meant fewer arms and ammunition would be needed to resolve this war. It was largely down to ink now, and that would frankly take long months, only the first of which was all that indecisive. Once it was clear that the Central Powers would not be resuming the war, the US government started to backpedal its expensive contracts. All of the non-producers had their contracts suspended on December 4th, or apparently sometimes the 5th. Other than Remington UMC, no one had delivered a single pistol, though North American Arms Company had apparently managed some pre-production samples. National Cash Register was also apparently at the very cusp of production, but had not actually delivered a handgun. AJ Savage, despite being nowhere near delivery, apparently did manage to provide 68,000 springs after the suspension of his contract. Remington UMC's 500,000 unit order was suspended on December 17, 1918. Negotiating with Ordnance, they were permitted to produce into February of 1919, creating an agreed upon 21,513 pistols. Curiously, small deliveries in April and May bumped this number up to 21,676, still very far short of the original request. It is very unlikely, by the way, that any Remingtons made it to the front lines during the war, but at least the Springfields and the Colts saw to the task at hand. We mentioned this last time, but just to reiterate, the automatic pistol model of 1911, regardless of who it was manufactured by, earned a fantastic reputation in combat and remained a point of American pride all the way through the Second World War, although by then it saw some changes that we will explore another day. Once the war was over and the contracts prematurely finished, whatever various parts were left over were collected at Springfield. Through 1920, the Armory took on cleaning up and repairing almost 200,000 model of 1911 pistols. It's also been said that additional examples were assembled, but that's actually been a matter of some controversy. I have something of the heart of that issue right here. It's a very unusual slide. This is the last argument for the early 1911s. This guy is a fairly plain slide. We have model of 1911 US Army on the right side, like you'd expect. If we flip it over, we have Colt's patent dates. And then we have a funny little mark we'll see in a second, and nothing else. And in terms of configuration, this does not match, in terms of especially the serrations, the Colt or the Springfields. It does, however, remind me of the Remington just a bit, because although not identical, we have that narrow leading serration once more. What is marked on the side, however, is very curious. We have a set of patent dates. These align with Colt's. The typography and layout is extremely similar, but not identical to Remington's own. And of course, there are no Remington UMC markings. Instead, we have an Ordnance logo, the flaming bomb, with an S in the middle. Early authors have claimed that these slides were from AJ Savage, but period reports don't seem to include any mention of them. To be frank, as it is, the slide is most likely from Remington, but Remington also set the pattern for all the other manufacturers to follow. It's worth noting, Winchester's records include a proposed slide marking of their own, which references the same patent dates in the same general layout, albeit in the drawing, it's somewhat different from what we see on the slides of the Remington or this pistol here. It really could be that any of the commercial manufacturers after Remington were gearing up to use the same general pattern of markings. Regardless of who, the most likely explanation for this slide is that it's surplus commercial components that were used to assemble somehow surplus frames, which is even more confusing as most of these turn up on Colt frames from 1918. Though that little coincidence might align with the fact that Colt was allowed to deliver out of sequential order during the war. Maybe some frames turned up later from whole pistols that failed inspection at one time or another. At this point though, on my part, this is all speculation. I'd recommend keeping an eye on a friend of ours, Archival Research Group, or perhaps even joining up to help put in effort into sifting the documents required to unravel a fairly persistent little mystery. Alright, that's about as much as we found fit to put on the screen for these, well, hold on, where am I at? These two pistols today. Go away, Colt, we already did you. But have no fear, next time we'll talk even more about the most requested firearm in our show's history. I hear tell we let some foreigners have them. But before that, however, let's hear from May on these two particular 45s. Once more, we've made room for May.
Hello.
And we have a trio of 1911s.
That we do.
Doesn't count as a smattering, I'm sorry.
No, it does not.
We have the Colt.
Yep.
Springfield.
Okay.
Remington.
Sure.
One of these three is not like the other.
This is true.
One of these three only ever managed to get like 90% parts interchangeability. But these two guys on the right, the Springfield and Colt, should be parts interchangeable.
Right.
Let's test that theory now.
Okay.
You ready? Now, for fairness, I'm going to give you the Springfield.
Okay.
Okay, you're holding it.
Definitely looks like a 1911.
Okay, I'm going to take that away.
Okay.
I'm going to give you the Colt.
Also seems like a 1911.
And I'm going to take that away.
Okay.
Now, close your eyes. Get your hand up there.
Okay.
Got your eyes closed. You're cheating?
Nope.
Okay. What did I just give you?
This feels like the Springfield.
Okay. And then, hold on. What did I just give you now?
It still feels like the Springfield.
That'd be weird if I gave it to you twice, but hold on.
I'm just telling you what it feels like.
Okay, hold on. There's no way you're going to get this right again.
Did you just hand me the Springfield like 3 times for some reason?
I didn't. You're really ruining my... Hold on. Let me just make sure of this real quick.
Is this one the Colt?
Okay. I was trying to go with the point that they're so interchangeable that you couldn't tell the difference between them, but apparently you have some sort of magic witch power in which you can tell the differences between 2 identical handguns.
Well, I think the finish is slightly different. It feel right here.
The finish is slightly different.
Feel right there. That feels slightly different from right there. And right here, this is super smooth by comparison.
I want to point out, some of you are imagining that there's like a scratch or something. There's no scratch. She's literally just talking about the texture of the finish. I can't tell the difference. Hold on, let me try the rimming.
This one's like fine, and then this one's slightly more coarse.
This is one of those arguments
one's super smooth
between whether or not something's blue or light blue
now
or
we're
whatever.
just petting 1911s.
You have completely ruined my segment.
Well, no, they just feel
Mate, the whole point was for me to hand you the
different.
guns and that they would feel identical because they're parts interchangeable identical guns.
Well, that's good then. Well, no, but they don't. But,
right, because you could tell the difference in the finish.
We're not replacing this part. We're not replacing that part right there. Everything else is
Can you tell the difference between this one and this one?
Well, I mean, this one feels smoother than that one.
Then what about this one? Does this feel?
Yeah, this one's the roughest one. This one's like
I believe
Papa Bear, Mama Bear, Baby Bear.
I think I know what happened here. The brush blue is more textured.
Yes.
Okay. I need to like rent you out for identifying authentic firearms because you are so tight.
Well, I'll be screwed if someone screws with this section because apparently that feels pretty good.
I don't want to hear it ever again that you can't appreciate the nuance in the differences between these guns. I don't want to hear any more complaints about our female markswoman. She can tell the difference in the finish on touch between 1911s.
Well, the Remington fish feels really good, which is kind of sad.
What is happening right now?
Well, you pet it. It feels good.
You are the gun witch. That is what I'm calling you now.
Okay.
Anyway.
I was a clay witch for a little while there, so I guess I can don a new title.
I actually have a headache. Like, this just did not...
I have a headache.
I already miss everything's different than other things.
Just when you touch
Here,
it.
tell me the differences between that and the Colt 1911.
Well, it looks like there's a little bit of a checkering difference on the slide release on this guy for the Springfield. And then the bottom of the mag has some wraparound metal.
Does any of this performative as the shooter, like, does any of this affect you as the shooter?
No, that affects me as the shooter.
Would you say that shooting that was any different from shooting the Colt?
Well, you know what? Actually, this was significantly different from shooting the Colt because for some reason... Every time we would get to the 6th round on the Springfield...
I know why you can tell them apart.
It would jam. Because I remember...
Yeah, the pain,
because
trauma.
My brain has like PTSD'd itself on this 1911.
It was over 100 degrees out. We were trying to get the filming done. I had test fired like 5 rounds through it, not thinking about... like I tended to actually load it with like 3 rounds to make sure that the lock open's working.
Right.
And just cycle a couple. And I just, for some reason, I guess I never put a full magazine in, or if I did, it just happened to work that one time.
And it's because he didn't do it.
We got out there, we tried 3 separate magazines. The 6th round always jammed. Always.
Yeah. It was consistent.
And it's one of those things that does reveal the weakness of the 1911, which is that it must be fit together properly.
Right. And if it's not, it is going to constantly tell you, I'm not fit together properly.
Now, this gun, we also had to swap the safety on while we were firing.
Yeah, I did notice on this one, and because we were playing with it off screen, that this was the original...
Yeah, I think I can find another original safety for this one. I think someone drifted the safety off of this and didn't know what they were doing and bent it. And it got bent back. You can see the stress line on it. And the safety just doesn't click positively in position and hold. And I think John lent us this gun. I think I'm going to be able to find him a replacement safety. Springfield safeties aren't the hardest thing in the world to find.
Trying to see if there's any sort of trigger difference. I don't really feel any difference between this and the Colt now that I'm feeling it out.
Really?
Yeah, the take-up's still pretty there. Maybe it's slightly creakier for the take-up. Short take-up, but cliff. Heavy cliff. I don't know, it feels pretty much on par with the Colts.
Okay. And then, so we had a safety malfunction. I had to swap that. Thank you, my buddy Taylor, for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, John, for the loan of this.
Yeah.
And then we'll have to figure out why your gun's doing that 6th round thing while it's
Very
here.
interesting.
Somebody will send me a message. I'm sure it's a well-known thing on 1911s. Every possible problem with a 1911 has been documented because, on the downside, after all of our praise last episode, 1911s can be pretty finicky.
Yeah, they really can be.
Especially when it comes to feed. That 2-piece feed system where the barrel has to meet right at the frame, has to have a good polish, it has to have the right dimensions in order to get that cartridge to boop and be where it belongs.
Right.
So poor May had, I don't know, like 7 jams trying to get the footage of this.
Super weird. Otherwise, nothing felt different. It really felt like it should have performed fine, but then we get to the 6th round and almost consistently every time. We finally had one good take and I was like, done, good. Give me the next 1911.
Oh, yeah. Springfield quickly became your least favorite.
But then when we had that, I went, oh no, what if the next one's going to be like? Because I knew there was more 1911 to come.
Right. We had the Remington.
Yes.
Which is only like 90% parts interchangeable.
Correct.
And that should have been worse.
It should have been.
Well, how'd the Remington do?
Fine. I didn't have any issues with it because it was like the Colt brush blue. It just performed. It was one take and done.
I have a theory there.
Because it's great.
No, because it's not parts interchangeable. So that means those are the original parts.
Oh,
Whereas
right.
this Springfield, somebody had, bent up the safety already playing with it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So who knows? Yeah, it's a Springfield barrel, but maybe it's not its original barrel. Or maybe it's been polished or something. You know what I mean? Like it's been maybe
You're
it's been
not
played
wrong.
with.
The chances of other parts making it into that piece or being monkeyed with is a greater chance than there would be with the Remington.
No, the
You're not
Remington is a
wrong.
Remington. And we know it because nothing else is going to fit quite right. I mean, I'm sure you could file and fit and hammer something in there if you had to, but given the wear on this one, it looks like all the parts are original.
Interesting.
It looks like they've all been together for a long time.
The trigger on this one does feel slightly different, by the way.
What do you mean?
It's got a little more take up, and then it doesn't feel like the cliff that you hit with the Springfield and the Colt brush blue is quite as significant.
Are you about to tell me that your favorite of the 1911s is the Remington UMC doesn't interchange with each other, like slap it out, worst serrations 1911?
It's kind of not bad.
Your
So honestly, no, the Colt brush blue was one of my favorites just shooting it because it felt very slick. The Remington kind of feels a little rougher, especially when I do things like mag replacement and stuff like that. It feels a little bulged. It's kind of sticky. Everything does kind of feel otherwise a little more rickety.
Let me get there, the Remington mag. I want to see how hard it is to put that in here. Oh. That's weird.
Just goes in?
No, it has a slight resistance at the top where you can tell the feed lips have taken a little bulge.
Uh-huh.
But I actually think it fits inside the Colt. Yes,
Slightly
it does.
better.
It's actually easier to get the Remington mag into the Colt than it is to get it into the Remington.
That's so sad.
It's unfair because these are the feed lips, so they could have taken a whack along the way.
Right.
But it is kind of funny and a clear difference that it's a clear sign that there's some differences in the dimensions because they do have a different tightness at the top of that magazine well. Are you playing with those serrations?
Yeah, I'm just looking at that front serration on the Remington Rand one where it's just like, it's got an unusually thin one at the very front and then everything else is the same.
They actually feel
Not
just
quite
as
as
sharp.
aggressive?
No, they feel just as sharp to me, and they're certainly as deep. They're just weird.
Yeah, they are a little different, aren't they?
But,
Huh.
well, let's put it to you this way. I know you had a bad time with this Springfield. Does that poison you on them as concepts?
No, because, I mean, I know that they have been fine in the past. I know there's other fine ones out there, and I'm sure that one is the result of, like you said, some
Tinkering.
parts being tinkered in and out of it.
Okay, so you trust one from Springfield as much as you trust the Colt, probably.
Yeah.
And that's just not this one.
Just that sample in particular had one specific issue, and it was
I kind of
very
like the
specific.
Springfield checkering, if I'm honest.
A little more aggressive.
While we're feeling things. Do you want to put them in your mouth? Do you want to check the mouth
I'm
feel?
not doing mouth feel on them.
Well, that's
yeah,
worn down.
This one's worn, yeah.
Now, the big question is, okay, so fairly equal to the Colt if it was running right.
Yeah.
What's going on here? Do you have any loss of confidence despite the fact that you know it's a little more slap shot? Slipshod? Slipshod.
No, I really don't. Because I understand it is still a 1911, so I know part support's still going to be pretty good for them.
Oh, you can make a bad 1911.
Can you?
Oh, there's some guys out there that make bad 1911s. I'll leave you guys in the comments to figure that out.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, you can make them bad. That's the whole point. They have to be fit together just right.
Well, you're not wrong. Obviously, the Springfield's an example of it not being put together just right, perfect. The tolerances on them just don't have that wiggle room.
I have a weird statement. I think I would trust the Remington UMCs.
Okay.
Because, you follow me if you will, they were being closer inspected, I think.
Okay.
Because their whole thing, ordinance, is like, look, as long as it fires reliably and functions reliably, we're fine. Would I trust it quite as much as the Colt? No. They don't have the experience. It's a Gen 1 product. I get it. But I do think the inspection was probably tight enough.
Okay.
Also, they never made it to the front, so you don't have to worry about that.
Oh, well, that's kind of nice.
You didn't have to worry about this. He was at the front line.
Yeah, that's fair.
But still, final impressions of 1911? Because this is not the last episode.
No, it's not the last episode. There's still more 1911 to come.
This is the worst episode the 1911s will do. And for you.
For me, yes.
Because right now, we've done the Colts, which you've assessed the 1911. We did a whole big thing on it.
Mm-hmm.
Then you're just doing the other 1911s that are identical to it almost.
Right.
So what are you going to say? But next episode, we're talking about foreign service 1911s.
Ooh. Interesting.
And we're going to shoot one in a different cartridge.
Is it still 1911 then?
It's actually identical except for the cartridge.
Okay.
So I hope that cartridge is significantly different or we're going to be in the hole again. And then after that, we get to shoot another foreign 1911 that has slightly different parts. And you all asked for this. So while we sit here and awkwardly try to discuss the same gun over and over again, you sit there and suffer because you demanded it.
This is y'all's fault.
Yeah.
This is entirely y'all's fault that we are doing so much 1911.
Yeah. Watch that footage again. Now, I do have special thanks for this episode. Once again, John, thank you for the Springfield. Let's see what we can do about that.
Thank you.
Brandon, thank you for the Remington. And
Taylor, thank you for also his lend as well.
Yeah, the other Springfield, which came in handy when we went out west and then with the parts for this one. Which your parts are back in your gun. Don't worry about it.
So thank you all guys for the lens. We appreciate it.
And then KW Keller again helped us get over the hump with the 1909. Sven is going to keep getting thanks on these for getting us through all the development stuff. Mm-hmm. And then in this episode specifically, we borrowed the slide, the mystery slide.
Oh, mystery
slide. From our buddy Rusty, who's been in our credits for a long time.
Yeah, he's been our exec producer grandfather.
Yeah. I managed to go to an event with him for the first time in years, and he just happened to have exactly what I needed right there. So it was perfect.
It's also good to see him.
Yeah. And let me make sure I'm not forgetting. Oh, Archival Research Group. I mentioned them earlier in the show. Double check them because they're following up on the slide thing after this episode. Mm-hmm. And we're on to our executive producers.
Huge thanks to Andy Wade. Guys, we are going to be seeing a lot more of this guy, just so you know.
Tom Batha is back, so I am assured that he is a 1911 fanatic. That's the only explanation.
And of course, Brian Ingram. Thank you so much. Guys, these are the ones that are making this episode specifically possible. And plus, they get their pretty names flashed up on the screen.
Well, we are a very small show. We are a very small team, and we're delivering a large documentary every other week. If you'd like to make that possible, the easiest way is to spend between $1 and $5 on Patreon or players supporting the show. For that, we have a behind-the-scenes podcast. We have a monthly scan for the guys at the $5 level.
Super pretty fancy.
Yeah, May does an excellent job with those.
That's true.
We're very direct and hands-on with those guys.
And then if you want to be the executive producer, you just have to reach out to us directly, and then you'll get a nice, pretty name flash.
Yeah, that's more of a one-time pop. There's a lot of guys that prefer to do it all at once and get it out of the way. So we'll take whatever we can get in terms of donations because we do our best to make this history free for everyone. We don't do any real exclusives in terms of this hard information that people want to hear.
And they're the ones that more dedicatedly, they're like, ooh, I really want to make sure this information is out there. Can I please make sure I sponsor this episode further so that you either get more details or you get more context or you get more resource material, whatever you need to make that episode more doable.
Yeah. So, again, support if you can. And if you can't, make sure you give a little nod of thanks to the guys that make sure that this is possible. But we can't do it just as a charity.
No.
But y'all have a good one.
Thank you, everybody. Can you imagine? We got the 1909 bits done, and we got Bruno doing the animation on that with the help of both you and Keller.
If you try to Google around for even diagrams on a 1909, the best you're going to get is the patents that don't actually match the pistol at all.
Right.
This is the best depiction of what is the original 1911 that has ever been seen on the internet.
Right.
And you think something as big as the 1911, wait, the internet doesn't have this depiction? No, it didn't. It didn't have it at all. Not until somebody came along and bothered to put it together.
We were one of the first ones out there.
So
the first ones out there.
There's actually, if you look around right now, I don't believe there's a single copy of the Belgian 1895 Nagant gas seal patent. I don't think there is available online. There's about to be on our website because it got found.
Right.
And then, therefore, Lars got a copy of it. So that was found in between the last 2 times we went.
Dang.
Stuff like that's starting to turn up. The hope is that this Marriott claim of Mueller's would turn up. But if those of you who remember me explaining what we don't know about revolvers, I said the other way to do this Marriott thing is to beat Mueller's claim date.
Right.
And I think I have. I will say, by the way, if anybody anywhere knows anything about records from August Frankot that I can get access to somehow, Frankot right now to me is the biggest black hole in the arms industry because they made everything. And there's just nothing written on them. Nothing that's not surface tier. You know what I mean? So just something to keep an eye out for. May and I have been having a conversation. What are we going to do about these stupid fake shutters? Are we going to get real shutters? Are we just going to get fake shutters that look like they're right? Are we going to get rid of the fake shutters entirely? What are we doing? I'm talking to the neighbor about this, and we're having this conversation. I said, plus I got to do something about those stupid fake shutters. And he goes, what do you mean? And I was like, well, there's no way that they don't even look right because they can't take up the whole window. And he's like, what? And I went, those are supposed to look like shutters, right? And he goes, yeah. And he goes, oh, and like I could see it on his face, right?
For the first time.
And it's like I poisoned him because he goes, "Oh God!"
Line than it should be. To save on burrs, a dimple was placed on one side, making it easier to align your punch. In 1913, January specifically, ordnance suggested a new flat-topped rear sight. This underwent testing throughout the year and was approved in September after it showed marked improvements in accuracy.